Good evening, everybody. Welcome to all of you. Our first annual, well, hopefully annual, Juneteenth Interfaith service. My hope is that we're going to be able to do a Juneteenth service at a variety of faith traditions, sacred spaces. So we're starting here in the Presbyterian Church, but we're having a Shabbat service put on by Temple Shalom, and it is so good to welcome our friends from Temple Shalom back to the Fanwood Presbyterian Church. They were here with us, sharing sacred space and cooperating in good works for 11 years or something like that, 12? Yes, and you were such a blessing to us then. You've continued to be a blessing. We've missed you, and we welcome you back. We welcome everybody else from the community who's joining us this evening. A special welcome also to those of you who are watching online. We're going to be treated this evening. I've promoted this to my Christian friends as an opportunity to connect with the Jewish roots of our liturgy, the Jewish roots of our work and our words, so that we can grow in understanding. And I also think it's an opportunity for us to experience and remember the many, many commonalities that our faiths share. And so welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to be blessed this evening as we celebrate Juneteenth and tonight celebrate the things of God. Celebrate justice, peace, liberation, love, reconciliation. So tonight I have a couple of friends to introduce, two people who are rocks of reconciliation and peace and healing in our community, Rabbi Joel Abraham and Dr. Nancy DiTomaso. I'll introduce Nancy later, but come on up, Joel. Thanks. Welcome. Enjoy the service.
He's taller than I am. I'll start by saying Shabbat Shalom. That was good. Just a few words of introduction, and I hope as we go through this service to kind of introduce what we're doing and how we do it and why we do it, so it is something that is as comfortable to you as it is to the members of our congregation. I will admit it is a somewhat odd thing that we are marking Juneteenth, the celebration of black liberation from bondage and slavery in this country, in a Scottish tradition Presbyterian church with a service led by a rabbi. I think, as David said, this is a piece that we are looking to broaden as we go forward, and also to acknowledge that our faiths and our communities are not as homogeneous as people might think they are. But one of the things that makes this special for us is Shabbat. In Judaism, the Torah tells us in two different stories of creation at the beginning of the Bible. One story says the world was created in 6 days, and on the seventh day God rested. And so in celebration of that creation, we come together on the seventh day, which we mark as starting on sunset on Friday evening and going to sunset on Saturday. And we celebrate that creation by coming together in worship. The other thing equally as important that we celebrate each Shabbat, and when we give our Kiddush, when we bless the Sabbath over wine, the blessing that we do mentions two things. It mentions a reminder of creation and a reminder of the Exodus from Egypt. One of the central stories of us in Judaism is remembering that we were slaves in Egypt thousands of years ago, and we try and see the world. We are commanded, for example, at Passover, to remember what it was like to be slaves, so we can see what it is like for other people who are in slavery and make sure that it is something that does not happen. So from the liturgy, I did bring and have highlighted some pieces that talk about bondage and freedom and that journey as well, but some of them are part of the regular part of our Shabbat service. So our service, traditionally in Judaism, we pray in Hebrew, and in our movement, the Reform movement in Judaism, we also pray in English as well. You will see the words of the prayers up on these screens to either side, which I encourage you to follow along with. Whenever there is Hebrew, there will be next to the Hebrew transliteration. That's the Hebrew words which are written in English letters, so you can follow along with the Hebrew as well. Any of the things, there are things that we sing or chant, some to traditional tunes, some to more modern tunes. Normally, my congregation appreciates that we have a cantor, a clergy person who specializes in bringing the music to life. Our cantor is celebrating with her family as her nephew becomes bar mitzvah this weekend. And so the rules in my congregation are when the cantor's away, you have to sing louder to drown out the rabbi. So I have enough congregants here to kind of help with that, but you can help them as well. Even though, as I know from the past, this is a very difficult acoustical space for you not to hear me sing over you, but sing loud so the people next to you at least can hear you. So we begin our worship. You'll see page numbers on the bottom. Those are references to our prayer books, which you don't have, so you'll have the words up here. We're going to start with this reading right here, and you can join me in reading if you can see the words. May the door of this sanctuary, I'm back one? Oh, it's too small for me to see anyway. Let's see. Why does it go in the wrong direction? One more. There we go. Thank you. You can tell me where I am. May the door of this sanctuary be wide enough to receive all who hunger for love, all who are lonely for friendship. May it welcome all who have cares to unburden, thanks to express, hopes to nurture. May the door of this sanctuary be narrow enough to shut out pettiness and pride, envy and enmity. Oops. So as we get ready to move toward worship, here is a traditional Jewish song. The words bim bam do not mean anything. They're a la la in Hebrew. And Shabbat Shalom, I already told you, means Shabbat peace. Bim bam, bim 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 bam, bim 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 bam, cheery beery beery bim bam, bim 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 bam, bim 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 bam. Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom. So now we move on to words that may be familiar to you in the English, words from Psalm 133. Hine ma tov umanayim shevet achim gam yachad. How good it is, how pleasant when we can sit together as family. Hine ma tov umanayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov umanayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov umanayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov umanayim shevet achim gam yachad. So now in Judaism we move toward the traditional beginning of our prayer service. It's an invitation to prayer. And it goes back to the days 2,000 years ago when our ancestors would worship in the temple in Jerusalem, and we would give this as an invitation, and the congregation would respond. A tradition in Judaism is to rise for this prayer, and as is tradition in Islam, where we face a place where our heart calls us to dwell, we also face the east toward Jerusalem. So we rise, and if you wish to face the east, it is in that direction. Luckily, there are words in the back, too. Baruch hu et Adonai HaMevorach. Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Leolam Va'ed. And we face back to the congregation in this traditional prayer, which comes as well from the book of Deuteronomy. It is kind of a pledge of allegiance in Judaism of sorts, a declaration of who it is that we believe in. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kivod Malchuto, Leolam Va'ed. Hear, O Israel, Adonai is our God, Adonai is one. Blessed is God's glorious and majestic name forever and ever. Now you may be seated. We continue with the next words which appear in the book of Deuteronomy, and we chant these to the traditional Torah trope. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha u'v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol meodecha ve'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha Vishinantam levanecha vidibarta ba'am bishivtecha beveitecha uvlechtecha vaderech uvshokbecha uvkumecha ukshartam liot al yadecha vehayu litotafot beineinecha Uktavtam al mizuzot beitecha uvisharecha leman tiskeru va'asitem et kol mitzvotai vitem kidoshim lelohechem. Ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeti etchem Me'eretz Mitzrayim liot lachem le'Elohim ani Adonai Elohechem. And the V'ahavta tells us the way that we show love for God is to keep all of God's commandments, to remember them day and night, morning and evening, when we go out and when we come in. And the reminder that comes at the end is that we do this because God brought us forth from Egypt. Therefore, we keep this covenant. Now let's read this together. Standing on the parted shores of history, so this is Judaism's original freedom song. The story goes that when we arrived at the Reed Sea and Pharaoh's army was behind us, we had no place to turn, and miraculously the sea parted and we could cross on dry land. And once we had crossed on dry land, we were on the other side and Pharaoh's army was unable to make it across, we came up with this song, led by Miriam, a prophetess in her own right and the sister of Moses. We sang this song, Mi Chamocha, who is like you, God. Yum bum 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 biddy bye, yabba bye bye bim bum. Yum bum 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 biddy bye, yabba bye bye bim bum. Yai die yadai die die, yabba bye bye bim bum. Yai die yadai die die, yabba bye bye bim bum. Mi kamocha boilim Adonai. Mi chamocha nedar bakodesh, nora tehilot osefele, nora tehilot osefele, mahalechutecha ra'uvanecha, bokeh hayam lifnei Moshe u'Miriam, zeheli anu ve'ameru, Adonai imloch leolam vaed. Now, this next prayer that we come to is a prayer that we only say in Judaism in an evening service. It is a prayer that reminds us, it's kind of the prayer that we say that we trust God to watch over us while we sleep. The rabbis believed that sleep was like a 60th part of death. So they asked God to create over us a sukkah, a temporary structure of peace, so that we could sleep in safety and in peace. Let's read together. Let there be love and understanding among us. Let peace and friendship be our shelter from life's storms. Adonai, help us to walk with good companions, to live with hope in our hearts and eternity in our thoughts, that we may lie down in peace and rise up waiting to do your will. Baruch atah Adonai, hapores sukat shalom aleinu v'al kol amo Yisrael v'al Yerushalayim. Blessed are you, Adonai, guardian of Israel, whose shelter of peace is spread over us, over all your people Israel, and over Jerusalem. Another prayer we do only in the evening and only on Shabbat is a prayer that talks about this moment of peace and of rest. These are words written by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who, if you often see pictures of Martin Luther King walking and there's a bearded rabbi next to him, that is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who used to say that when he was marching with King, he was praying with his legs. Together? We are, oh wait, it's not up there yet. There we go. We are a people in whom the past endures, in whom the present is inconceivable, without moments gone by. The Exodus lasted a moment enduring forever. What happened once upon a time happens all the time. Now we come to what we call the central portion of our worship service. Tefillah means the prayer. The rabbis imagined it as, they thought a metaphor of visiting God might be like visiting an earthly ruler. And so we traditionally rise at this point. We face the east. We introduce ourselves to God as the descendants of Abraham and Sarah, of Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Rachel, and Leah. We then, in the second prayer, praise God, or as you would praise a ruler for the strength that they have, and in the third prayer for that unique quality of God, which is holiness. So if you are comfortable, please rise. If you wish to face the east, it is in that direction. Adonai sifatai tiftach ufi yagid tehilatecha. Adonai, open up my lips, that my mouth may declare your praise. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, v'Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel, v'Elohei Leah, El Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, V'Konei Hakol, V'Zocher Chastei Avot v'Imahot, U'Mevi G'ula Livnei V'Nehem, Leman Shemo B'Ahava. Melech Ozer Umoshia Umagin. Baruch Atah Adonai, Magen Avraham ve'ezrat Sarah. Atah Gibor Le'o. No, we're not on the right page. Where are we? Nope. No, back. There we go. Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai, Mechaye HaKol Atah, Rav Lehoshia, Morid Hatal, Mechalkel Chaim Bechesed, Mechaye HaKol Berachamim Rabim, Somech Noflim Virofei Cholim, Umatir Asurim, Umekayem Emunato, Lishene Afar, Micha Mocha Bal Givurot, Umidom Melach, Melech Memit Umechaye, Umatzmiach Yeshua. V'ne'eman atah l'hachayot hakol, Baruch atah Adonai, Mechaye hakol. Atah kadosh v'shimcha kadosh, U'kedoshim b'chol yom, Yehalalucha selah. Baruch atah Adonai, Ha'el hakadosh. Please be seated. So in a daily worship service, this place would come where you petition the ruler, where we ask God for certain things. But on the Sabbath, not only do we take this day off, but we give God the day off as well. So traditionally, we have in this space what's called a Kiddushat Hayom, a prayer for the holiness of the day. It seemed appropriate to me at this point for us to share words of Amanda Gorman, the Youth Poet Laureate of the United States, words that she shared on the special day of the inauguration of Joseph R. Biden, and this is an excerpt of the poem that she gave on this day. If you would read with me. We will not march back to what was, but move to what shall be, a country that is bruised but whole, benevolent but bold, fierce and free. Will not be turned around or interrupted by intimidation, because we know our inaction and inertia will be the inheritance of the next generation. I'm sorry, that was too many pages. That's one more. Whoops, wrong way. Going back. That's going forward. Why is it going forward? Can we get this back to the second slide? Our blunders. If only I could see this well. Together, our blunders become their burdens, but one thing is certain. We merge mercy with might, and might with right, then love becomes our legacy, and change our children's birthright. So let us leave behind a country better than the one that we were left with. No, that's the wrong way again. It switched on us. that it? Every breath, yes. Every breath from my bronze-pounded chest, we will raise this wounded world into a wondrous one. We will rise from the gold-limb hills of the west. We will rise from the wind-swept northeast, where our forefathers first realized revolution. We will rise from the lake-rimmed cities of the Midwestern states. We will rise from the sun-baked south. We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover, and every known nook of our nation and every corner called our country, our people, diverse and beautiful, will emerge, battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light, if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. So this section of the service concludes with a prayer for peace. Shalom Rahava Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Shalom Rahava Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Ki atahu melech adon lechol hashalom. Ki atahu melech adon lechol hashalom. Shalom Rava Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Shalom Rava Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. V'tov be'einecha livarech et Amcha Yisrael b'chol et u'v'chol sha'a b'shlomecha. Shalom Rava Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Shalom Rava Yisrael Amcha Tasim Le'olam. Tasim Le'olam. Baruch atah Adonai Amvarech et amo Yisrael Bashalom. Before we conclude this section of the service, the rabbis knew that sometimes we needed words to trigger us to prayer, and sometimes there were prayers we had of our own, sometimes prayers that had no words at all. So into this section of the service, they added the Tfilat Halev, a time for the silent prayer of our hearts. Oh, say shalom bimroma, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru, imru, amen. Oh, say shalom bimroma, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol Yoshvei Tevel. Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu, V'al Kol Yisrael, Yaseh Shalom, Yaseh Shalom, Shalom Aleinu, V'al Kol Yisrael. May the one who makes peace in the high heavens make peace for us, for all Israel, and for all who dwell on earth. And we say, Amen. So the next part of our service, traditionally, we take out our Torah scroll and read from the wisdom of our ancestors. The blessing that we do before this is we say, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of all, who has given us holiness through commandments and commanded us to engage in words of Torah. So most of the Torah, of the learning that we will be doing today, will be from Dr. DiTommaso. But just a brief word, in Judaism we go through a lectionary where we go through the Torah in order. We divide the Torah up so that each week of the year we do a separate piece. So we go from the beginning of the book of Genesis to the end of the book of Deuteronomy, and then at the holiday of Simchat Torah we do the end and the beginning and start again each year. In the Jewish lectionary we are this week on the parsha known as Korach, named after Korach, the revolutionary. In the good sense, this is a Torah portion that speaks about revolution. It says a challenge to leadership that says, are we not all holy? The bad news is this is not a good revolution, and in fact, it ends up with those who revolt being swallowed by the earth. So as we stand in this very difficult place in our national history, we learn what are the good revolutions, when it's time to stand up, when it's time to change things and make them equal for all. And we also remember with this Juneteenth celebration the end of a bad revolution in which people who stood up not for the rights of others but to be able to keep the rights from others were finally vanquished, and those people who had not had rights, at least not had rights given to them by the state, certainly rights given to them by God, were allowed those rights, at least in some portion, although it is a fight we are still fighting. And so now I invite up again Reverend Janke to introduce our speaker this evening.
I've been learning from Joel for 16 years now. He's been a very good friend, a mentor to me. And the same can be said of Dr. Nancy DiTommaso. She's helped me to become the pastor that God was calling me to be, guiding me many times along the way. For many years she did interviews. She's going to tell you about, I think, some of the work that she's been doing. And I don't know, 6 years ago or something, she released her life's work as she described it. And it is work that is all about majority people who have privilege and an abundance of resources being called to share out of that abundance rather than keeping it to themselves and within their own families, within their own groups, within their own classes, learning the justice of sharing. And she can say it much better than me. So we are grateful for Dr. Nancy DiTommaso coming and sharing with us this evening. Let's welcome her.
Does this allow me to? Okay, well, yes, thank you. Thank you all for inviting me. I appreciate Pastor Janke and Rabbi Abraham in asking me to share with you some ideas. I'm only going to very briefly talk about my book, which actually was 10 years ago, 2013 it was published. Instead, I want to talk about the celebration of Juneteenth, which is a celebration of freedom, emancipation, and jubilee, which of course is a concept shared both by Christians and Jews. And in doing so, if we can make this move forward. Okay, good. I want to talk about three general ideas around the issue of how we understand, celebrate, and move from the issue of the celebration of Juneteenth. So I do want to talk about what Juneteenth is and what the celebration is. It is a celebration of the emancipation, the freedom, the resilience, the hope, and the jubilee for African Americans. But I also want to talk about what happened after Juneteenth, both before and after it actually, the complications that both before and after Juneteenth, there were very sustained and successful efforts to undermine the equality that was promised to African Americans. In fact, there was 100 years of additional oppression of various sorts, and I want to just call that to our attention. And then finally, I want to talk about where do we go from here, because we seem to be in another period in which there's a very active effort to undermine equality and to take rights from people again, including African Americans, Jews, and others. And in my discussion of the courses of action, I'm going to talk particularly about white people, recognizing that most of us were not necessarily always thought of as white, and that it has been, in fact, for 250 years, a contest, a struggle for many groups to be thought of as white when they previously were not. And I will say in general that historically, we didn't use the concept of white until about 1691. Before 1691, the differentiation was between Christians and heathens. And heathens were a whole collection of people. Christians were a smaller group. But as African American slaves began to adopt Christianity, it became more difficult to oppress them, and so there was a change in the law to identify people as white versus others. And then there was a series of rights that became associated with being white. So again, many hundreds of years over that period where various groups tried to file lawsuits to be identified as white, and that was quite a difficult and uneven process, which some scholars call the elasticity of whiteness. So first of all, I want to talk about what is Juneteenth. On June 19th, 1865, federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas, and announced the emancipation of those people who were still enslaved. Why is that significant? Is because Texas was the furthest western point of what was at that time the United States, and essentially the Emancipation Proclamation, which became official in January 1st of 1863, in the context of the Civil War, did not free slaves unless there were federal troops present. So it was only as federal troops moved across the country in the context of the Civil War that federal troops were able to enforce the emancipation of slaves. So African Americans, since 1865, June 19th, 1865, which was supposedly this last point in what was then the United States, where emancipation was announced, has made this a point of celebration to demonstrate their resilience, their hopes for the future, and their rights to equal treatment. But again, one thing I learned, I didn't know, This proclamation only applied to those states that had been part of the rebellion. And it envisioned African Americans essentially continuing to work on the same plantations they had previously worked on as paid laborers. So it did not free them to have the same kind of life as others. It simply declared they were no longer slaves. So what happens on Juneteenth when it is celebrated by African Americans? There typically is the reading of the Emancipation Proclamation. There's the singing of traditional songs like Lift Every Voice and Sing. There's the reading of African American writers and storytelling, street fairs, family reunions, cookouts, and often political organizing, such as voter registration drives. It's traditional to wear red, and to drink red drinks and eat red foods. So one scholar talked about this as celebrate, educate, and agitate as what Juneteenth is about. But let me read you the order that was, I know you probably can't actually read this yourself, so let me read you this order, which is called General Order Number 3, read by Major General Gordon Granger in Galveston, Texas, June 19, 1865. What he said, with 2,000 U.S. troops there to enforce it, said, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between an employer and hired labor. The freedmen," and pay attention to this part, "are advised to remain at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts, and they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere." So even though it was a proclamation of freedom for the slaves, it did not free them from what was expected of them in terms of their work for people on the plantation. So there's other things that are important to know. And some of these things, again, I did not know until I started looking into this more. Juneteenth was not the end of slavery in the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation only applied to those states that were still in rebellion. And there were 4 states, Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, and Kentucky, that remained in the Union as slave states, and their slaves were not freed by Juneteenth and that proclamation, that Emancipation Proclamation. And Tennessee, by that point, was already occupied by U.S. troops. Even though a slave state, their slaves were not freed by this proclamation. So if there were no federal troops present, there was no way to enforce the Emancipation Proclamation, and in fact, it wasn't abided by without federal troops present. Interestingly, particularly if you go back and read some of the things that Lincoln and others had said at the time, freeing the slaves was not the original goal of trying to save the Union. The goal was to prevent slavery from being extended to the territories that were not yet part of the colonies, what was then the United States. So it was an interesting situation at the time that what we think of as the North and the South were relatively balanced in terms of their representation in Congress, and so they didn't want new territories to come in as states, as slave states, because then slave states would have the majority in the Congress. And so it was very important not to extend slavery into these territories, and that was really Lincoln's goal. He said explicitly in his first inaugural he did not intend to free the slaves in the existing states in the country, because since it was in the Constitution, he didn't think he had the right. But his goal was to prevent slavery from being extended. And it was only later, as the war progressed, that he came to realize that emancipating the slaves was a key part of moving forward. So the Emancipation Proclamation, which we think of as such a historic achievement in terms of our country, was first of all a threat from Lincoln to the existing slave states. If you don't come back into the Union, then I will free your slaves. It was also an incentive. If you come back into the Union, I won't free your slaves. And then it was also a necessity. The war was not going particularly well for the North at that time. They needed the help of the slaves as soldiers, as helping the army. And so the Emancipation Proclamation has that kind of complicated history. So then what happened afterwards? And here, from both before and after the Emancipation Proclamation, and then Juneteenth and the proclamation in Galveston, Texas, there was an effort to undermine, reverse, and renege on the promises of equality. And that continued rather successfully for at least 100 years. And then even since, we think of as the second effort of equality in the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, since then we are still struggling for equality and need to understand where the points of hope and change need to be addressed. So I don't know if you're familiar with a very important book called Slavery by Another Name by Douglas Blackman. It's also a PBS video. It is certainly worth your time because it explains what happened, particularly with that clause about slaves were not allowed to be idle. It was not expected that they could leave their plantations and go somewhere else. And at that point in history, and it's important that we don't try to take where we are in 2023 and read it back into 170 years ago, but even abolitionists, who were the ones that were sparking the effort to free the slaves, were ambivalent about the meaning of emancipation. Few of them actually believed in equality. Some thought that if the slaves were freed, they needed to be shipped back to Africa. Some thought that they needed to continue to work as wage labor. Very few thought that equality meant equality with those defined as white at the time, even among abolitionists and certainly not in many others in the population. And again, the main political point before the Civil War was to prevent the expansion of slavery to new territories. And one footnote to this, which I think is worth our considering, is the reason there was this opportunity for new territories and the introduction of new states was because of the Louisiana Purchase that President Thomas Jefferson had agreed to with Spain giving up their territories in what was then the United States in 1803. Why did Spain sell their territories to the U.S. in the Louisiana Purchase? It was because of the slave revolt in Haiti that occurred around that time. And France was not able to both deal with the slave revolt in Haiti and continue their colonial adventures in what's now the continental United States. So France, they had just had their own revolution in 1789. They faced the revolt of slaves in the Caribbean, but particularly from Haiti. And so that gave the opportunity for the U.S. to expand their territory. Of course, these territories also included Native Americans. But because of that, there was this opportunity to expand with new states. And then there was a fight over whether they should be slave or free. And let me also mention that what France did was also what the U.S. did and many other places in the world at that time. After the slave revolt in Haiti, France couldn't immediately deal with it, but a few years later they sent warships to Haiti to demand that Haiti pay reparations for the property that had been taken from them, meaning the slaves that had been taken from them. And they forced Haiti to pay reparations for 125 years. And that is one of the reasons that Haiti is the poorest country in the hemisphere and stable, because of the effects of that kind of continued oppression. And it was also true in the United States. Although there was a promise for a short period of time that former slaves would get 40 acres and a mule, in fact, they never did. And instead, the U.S. paid compensation to slave owners and never paid slaves for their labor, because slaves were thought of as property. And therefore, the notion that someone would be denied their property meant they had to be compensated. And again, slave owners were compensated, slaves were not. And so given the instability and the difficulty of enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation, the fact that slavery was written into the Constitution, there was the effort to pass several amendments that are called the Reconstruction Amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, to make it more likely that slaves, in fact, would become free. The 13th Amendment, which was not passed until December 6, 1865, so this is after Juneteenth, of course, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude except as a punishment for crime. And one of the crimes was being a vagrant, meaning not having a job. So if you tried to leave your plantation and go elsewhere, you could be arrested and forced back into labor. I don't think you can see this picture, but essentially it's showing black men in prison garb. Again, this comes from slavery by another name. There was a lot of enforced labor following emancipation, following Reconstruction, on the guise that these people were vagrants and therefore they were breaking the law, and they were forced into continued service, unpaid service. And then the 14th Amendment, which we've heard so much about recently, was not passed until 1868. That provided citizenship, equal protection of the law, and due process, but much of it was not enforced because it was controversial at the time. It was passed, it was ratified, but it often was not enforced. And then finally, the 15th Amendment, which was not ratified until 1870, prohibits federal or state governments from denying the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. However, what happened almost immediately after that was that as Confederate states began to come back into the Union, they passed new constitutions that included things like poll taxes, literacy tests, residency rules, and grandfather clauses, meaning that unless you had a grandfather who was able to vote before this emancipation took place, you couldn't vote. And so all across the slave states, there were these mechanisms that, despite all the promises, did not allow, in fact, freedom to take place. And again, it continued for 100 years. And then, at the end of Reconstruction, in 1877, federal troops were removed from the South, and then we had an introduction in a new way of mass terrorism against former slaves. The rise at that time of the Ku Klux Klan again occurred in 1865, right after Juneteenth, other terrorist organization that enforced African American subordination. We had the emergence of Jim Crow laws, tenant farming, and essentially the perpetuation of forced labor. And further, blacks were prevented from leaving the South. They couldn't go somewhere else until the invention of the cotton gin, which was around 1919 or so. And if blacks, against all those odds, happened to prosper, build businesses, build their own communities, those were, under various circumstances, destroyed. We've heard recently about Tulsa. There's also Rosewood, other communities where blacks were successful, who essentially whites came in and burned the place down, killed people, and so on. So again, 100 years after Juneteenth, there still was a need for an active struggle for equality until 1964 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in the United States, and then we have continued to struggle since then, and we again are in a new era where there's an effort to take away rights that already had been granted and to not enforce rights that supposedly exist. So where do we go from here? What particularly are the responsibilities of those who are not part of the African American community? And I want to particularly talk about whites, again, noting that being white is not a clear-cut concept. It has varied greatly over time, and it's a contested concept. Other groups, of course, could be part of this conversation, but each have their own stories, and so that becomes a little complicated. So essentially, in my final part of my conversation, I want to talk about what are the responsibilities of whites who care about social justice. And this is where I get into some of the stuff from my book and my previous subsequent research. I would argue that our focus on racism and discrimination as the main barrier to equality essentially prevents us from understanding our own responsibilities in perpetuating racial inequality. Because we so often talk about the problem is racism, and when we say that, we mean those racists, not me, we essentially are allowed to ignore our own participation in the reproduction of racial inequality. And so that is something that I think the white community needs to be challenged by and understand and do something about. And again, what I found in my book, which essentially I interviewed people in different parts of the country, white people in different parts of the country, to find out their job histories, as well as their views about inequality in government and affirmative action, everything else. And what I found was that 70% of the jobs that people had over their lifetimes was because somebody helped them get a job. Somebody from their family, their community, their neighborhood, and of course, because of the segregation that exists, this meant white people helping other white people for the most part. 30% of the time, 30% of the jobs was because either the help wasn't needed, because there was a very hot job market, because the help couldn't be used, because the person wasn't competent enough to use it, and a few other isolated things. But essentially, whites help other whites, and it's because of that that we continue to reproduce racial inequality in our experience, in our lifetime, in our current day. So one of the things that I say in my book, and again, I'm not going to take time to explain it, but the ultimate white privilege is the privilege not to be a racist and to still benefit from racial inequality. Doing things of helping our friends, our neighborhoods, our families, our acquaintances, people like us, we think of as a good thing. And yet, we don't understand the way in which that excludes opportunity for other people. I talk about this in terms of bias for versus bias against. The news media, public policy, and most of us in our heads think about the problem of racial inequality as being biased against African Americans or women or other non-white groups. But I would argue that the main dynamic that reproduces racial inequality is the bias for whites, and white men particularly. So white people, I'm only going to give you one data point, but trust me, these are the data. White people continue to be overrepresented in the best jobs, whether we're talking about managerial jobs, professional jobs, or craft jobs. And this hasn't changed, for the most part, over the last 60 years, despite growing diversity in the population. And again, it's because we think that it's those people who are the racists, not us, that we never address these kinds of issues. And again, I heard this a lot in the interviews. We say we believe in equal opportunity, but we essentially spend our lives seeking unequal opportunity. We look for advantages for our kids, for ways in which we can help them get ahead. And in doing that, we essentially, again, are reproducing racial inequality in ways that we're not understanding in our own experiences. This is how I try to provide a graphic of it, is if you look on the far right over there, you'll see what I label as favoritism advantage. Two people shaking hands, helping each other. We never think about that. We think about inequality as on the far left here, somehow purposely keeping people out. And that's not what we do most of the time. It's not that we're mostly keeping people out. Occasionally, it's the middle where we're just indifferent. We just don't never think about what's happening to other people's lives. But instead, we are actively helping our friends, our family members, and people in our community, and people who are like us. That's what is really reproducing racial inequality, not so much the active effort to keep people out. Now, in this current political environment, yes, we see some very explicit racism in ways that did not exist before, was not considered polite, and yet I still don't think that's where most of the real issues are in terms of reproducing racial inequality. So let me just show you one data point. I hope you can see this. My scanner isn't working, so I couldn't bring an updated chart. This only goes from 1980 to 2005. But the darker line that is marked 0, which is in the middle, would be holding managerial jobs in the proportion of your availability in the workforce. And again, if you could see it, if you look at the dotted line way above, that's 0. That's white men. You'll see from 1980 through 2005, and I can tell you it's continued up to the present, white men are overrepresented in managerial jobs by 60%. They are 60% more likely to be in managerial jobs than their availability in the labor force. If you look below that 0, the first line that you see is white women. You'll see there was a gradual improvement for white women, but it leveled off around 2000 and didn't get much better after that. Essentially, white women were underrepresented in managerial jobs by 45%. It currently is around 35%. The line under that is black men were 60% underrepresented in managerial jobs, almost the same by 2005. So 35 to 50 years after the Civil Rights Act, almost nothing has changed in terms of who's holding what kinds of jobs, with very few exceptions. And then the line at the very bottom is black women. They were 80% underrepresented, almost the same to the present. So essentially, we think that there's been major changes because we have much more diversity in the labor force. That's true. We do have much more diversity in the labor force because there's been a decline in the population among whites in particular, but those people are taking jobs essentially that have been part of the growth of the labor force. They're not displacing white men. White men have not suffered because of any changes in the population. The only place where there's been a slight shift has been in social service jobs, and that's pretty slight. Again, it's not the jobs that white men mostly want. So what are the responsibilities for whites in terms of being an ally and an advocate for social justice? Well, I would argue that this needs to be thought of at both the individual level, at the organizational level, and at the societal level. At the individual level, I would say we need to think actively about not only helping our own children in our community, but other people's children and their communities as well. At the organizational level, if you have a position that is, you can have an influence, you can make a decision about hiring, or otherwise you simply have some authority, or even not, you can be a sponsor as well as a mentor. A mentor giving advice, a sponsor giving opportunity. And in doing that, it's important to help connect those people who are underrepresented in to people in leadership, to opportunity, to training, to visibility, and so on. And at the societal level, we need to help elect leaders and support policies that will make things more equitable and socially just. So my final comments is that Juneteenth celebrates African American triumph, resilience, but also the continued need for vigilance, what in some contexts is called being woke. Those people who are not African American, not defined as African American, but especially whites, need to support these goals. Because even after emancipation, slavery and slave-like conditions continued, freedom and rights were undermined, and the struggle has continued and needs to continue from here. We are currently in a period where rights are being suppressed and revoked, so now more than ever, those of us who are not African American need to support social justice by recognizing our own contributions to inequality and actively supporting a more just future. Thank you.
So after the service, there will be time for fellowship and to continue the conversation. For those of you who are interested in doing that work in this community, the organization known as Social Justice Matters holds regular meetings and engages in some lobbying activity to help this. If you are interested in learning about reparations and what's being done in reparations in New Jersey, feel free to come talk to me. I'm one of the representatives from Social Justice Matters on the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice's reparations campaign, in which they're trying to create a group sponsored by the New Jersey legislature that will study the idea of reparations in New Jersey. The other thing, of course, in terms of celebrating Juneteenth is that for the past 7 years, I believe, Social Justice Matters has been sponsoring a Juneteenth celebration at various different places. And in the past 3 years, we have had at Shady Brook, for those of you who don't know, members of the Scotch Plains and Fanwood community, the first African-American-owned country club, golf club, is the Shady Rest Country Club, which is here in Scotch Plains and has been restored recently by a great committee of people that put it together. It has some great history to see in there. The first golf pro in the United States, for those of you following golf news right now, the first golf pro, not the first African-American golf pro, but the first professional golfer in the United States was John Shippen, who was the golf pro after a while, and there's a nice museum to John Shippen at the Shady Rest. So if you would like to join for this year's Juneteenth celebration, which has become co-sponsored by both Fanwood and Scotch Plains since just before Juneteenth was made a federal and state holiday, it begins at noon. I'm looking at Amy Winkler, who's the Secretary for Social Justice Matters, sitting right there. It begins at noon right outside in the parking lot of Shady Rest. And there's also some additional parking nearby, and there will be celebrations and dancing and cultural celebrations and representation from different organizations and food and all sorts of wonderful things. So I encourage you to come and join what is a community celebration of Juneteenth. Now, we go back to our worship service. At this point in our worship service, traditionally, we take a moment to remember those in our community who are in need of healing. So what's going to happen now is, this is a blessing which was adapted by a woman named Debbie Friedman. We're going to sing the first verse of this, and then what I'm going to do is I read a list of members of the congregation who have let me know they wish to be, they or their friends, on a list because they are in a place where they could use a blessing for healing. And then after that, I will go around and look around the room, and anyone who wishes to add a name of someone who would like to be added to this prayer for healing, please take your turn and do so, and then we will sing the second half of this blessing and wish for healing for those in our communities in need of healing. Mi sheberach imotenu Mekor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Remember for healing, Sandra Kahn, Patrick Beatty, Natalie Nelson, Penny Trank, Bob Newman, Ellen Berman, and Mi sheberach imotenu mekor habracha leavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen. As we move to the concluding prayers of our service, we go to a prayer called the Aleinu, which says, it is upon us to give praise and to think of the future and the world that we wish to create. This is another prayer that we rise and face the east, so join us if you are able. Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, latet gedula liotzer breshit, shelo asanu k'gayei ha'aratzot, velo samanu k'mishpechot ha'adama, shelo sam chelkenu kahem, v'gohor aleinu Kechol hamonam, v'anachnu korim, Umishtachavim umodim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim hakadosh baruch hu. Please be seated. This is a prayer thinking about our future written by the poet Judy Chicago. Please join me. And then all that has divided us will merge. And then compassion will be wedded to power. And then softness will come to a world that is harsh and unkind. And then both men and women will be gentle. And then both women and men will be strong. And no person will be subject to another's will. And then all will be rich and free and varied, and the greed of some will give way to the needs of the many. And then all will share equally in the earth's abundance, and then all will care for the sick and the weak and the old, and then all will nourish the young, and then will cherish life's creatures, and then all will live in harmony with one another and the earth, and then everywhere will be called Eden once again. Now, in Judaism, our tradition, in each time we gather together to worship, is to remember those who have come before, those whose gifts we have passed on, those whose stories we know and tell. Our tradition is to read the names of those who have passed in the past 30 days, in the period of Shloshim, and those whose anniversary of whose death occurs in this past week, this past Shabbat. It is a tradition in our congregation, if we come to the name of someone that you are here to remember, that you rise, and if you wish, just to share a brief word or sentence about them so we can remember them with you. And then we'll remain standing, and we will all rise to cite the mourner's Kaddish together. On this Shabbat, we remember in the period of Shloshim, Harry Juris, the father of Peter Juris, Carol Itkin, cousin of Arlene Burstein and Maura Geller, and Mark Levy, the husband of Kathy Matamid and father of Talia and Maddie. We also remember those whose yahrzeit occurs on this Shabbat: Morris Alpine, Dora Bashover, Samuel Becker, Yetta Bussell, Miriam Candib, Barbara Davis, Philip Diamond, Martin Eisenberg, Ann Enda, Ann Friedman, Myrna Friedman, David Frischman, Max Glass, Rebecca Greenbaum, Helen Harris. Marvin Isaac, Joseph Jacob, Sidney Jaffe, Ann Johan, Beatrice Joseph, Joe Kaziel, Samuel Klein, Bertha Leppelstadt, Rose Lyons, Joel Moskowitz, Charles Nischbal, Sarah Oringer, Dora Persky, Eugene Price, Stanley Richmond, Manoli Romero Hombrebueno, Ruth Rutenberg, Hinda Schoenthal, Frida Schulman, Charlotte Skalka, Isabel L. Vanko, Anna Marie Vargas, Beatrice Werner, Louis Wolfson, Harold Yud, founding family of Temple Shalom, Marjorie Zinn, and Murray Zucker. Are there any names that anyone would like to add? In their memory, in the memory of all those in our hearts, all those recent victims of violence and terror, of the disease that ravages our world, of all those who have no one to say the Kaddish for them, we rise as a congregation to recite the Kaddish Yatom. Yitgadal v'yitkadash Shemei Rabbah, v'alma divarach hirutei v'almlich malchutei, v'chaye echon v'yom echon u'v'chaye dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'vizman kariv v'imru amen. Yehei Shmei Rabbah mivorach le'olam l'olmei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh. V'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal Shmei dekudsha barichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tushbechata v'nechemata. Ta'amiran bi'alma v'yimru amen. Yehei Shlama Rabbah min Shemaya. V'chaim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'al kol yoshvei tevel, v'imru amen. Oseh shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom. Aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel, ve'yimru the source of peace and peace to all those who mourn, and give us the strength to comfort those who are bereaved. And we say, Amen. You may be seated. Traditionally, at this portion of the service is when we share announcements. Again, I'll remind you of the Juneteenth celebration, the Scotch Plains Fanwood Juneteenth celebration, sponsored by Social Justice Matters in Scotch Plains and Fanwood, which begins at noon tomorrow outside of Shady Rest. And encourage you, whatever town you live in, to find whether or not they are celebrating Juneteenth and find a way to do so and wear red and drink your red soda and all of those important things. Hear stories of triumph. I would like to thank the Fanwood Presbyterian Church and Reverend Janke for coming up with this. We were going to do our own Juneteenth service over at Temple Shalom, and then this invitation came. Thank Dr. DiTomaso for sharing her words and wisdom, and wish her luck in her continued work, in her retirement from Rutgers in the next few weeks, but her continuation with her studies, her research, and hopefully her sharing that with the community. Are there any other announcements that we should share? Yes, if you are a member of Temple Shalom, we provide, if there's a fifth Friday in the month, we provide meatloaves for St. John's Soup Kitchen in Newark. And so those meatloaves are due here. This is a month with a fifth Friday, so make sure to drop those off at the temple before that Thursday evening before the Friday. And if you are interested in serving at that at the soup kitchen, please let Jill Harris, who's up here in front, know. It is nice for us to be here as well. We conduct our annual food drive at Yom Kippur. When we fast, we save food for others. That comes here to the Fanwood Presbyterian Church Food Bank. So this is the food bank that we have been donating to for a number of years. There are opportunities to donate any day. There are baskets and boxes outside. I'm sure if you wish to help in that ministry, you can talk to Pastor Janke about that. Anything else? Anyone else have any Juneteenth events coming up they want to share, or other events? Yes, if you have children ages 0 to 5, and you would like to attend our Shabbat pray and play tomorrow morning, that begins at 10 o'clock at the temple. And it's a wonderful opportunity. It's a mixture of a worship service and a kind of parent and child event. We have parachutes, we have bagels, all of that fun kind of stuff. All right, so as a closing song, this is a statement made by Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who was a Hasidic Rebbe who lived in the 1700s. And he said, Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar ma'od. All the world is a very narrow bridge. Va'ikar lo lefaked klal. And the most important thing, even though it's a narrow bridge where we may feel that we could fall off on either side, for us as human beings is to realize we cannot let fear rule over us. So I invite you to join with me. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar me'od. Gesher tsar me'od. Gesher tsar me'od. Kol ha'olam kulo. Gesher tsar me'od. Gesher tsar me'od. Gesher tsar me'od. Ve'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. Ve'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar me'od. Gesher tsar me'od. Gesher tsar me'od. Kol ha'olam kulo gesher tsar me'od. Gesher tsar me'od. Ve'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. Ve'ha'ikar lo lefached klal. Please rise. And I would invite Reverend Janke to join me here. I'll offer my words, you can offer yours. Traditionally in benediction, we turn to the words of the book of Numbers, the priestly benediction, and we ask for God's blessing upon us all. Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. May God bless you and keep you. Ya'er Adonai panav elecha v'chunecha. May the light of God shine for you and be gracious to you. Yisa Adonai panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. And may God turn God's face to you and give you a blessing of peace.
He said it all. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you. The Lord look upon you with favor and grant you peace. And God's people say,
Amen.
Thank you, Joy.
Where is fellowship?
Fellowship is in the dining room. You can follow Joel and I over there. You just go straight out the door to the corner of the other building, into the door and up the stairs.
It's that place we used to do service.
That's right. That's right.